Well, speaking of love, I don't see them here today. Maybe they're joining us online, but yesterday, Dale and Inga Britt Dickinson celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. So they may be tired from celebrating yesterday. So congratulations to them. A couple weeks ago, our oldest had a birthday. She's self-supporting, thankfully. But she turned 31. I texted her on the morning of her birthday and said, "Happy birthday." And she texted back a few minutes later and said, "Well, thank you, love you, happy anniversary on being a parent." It was our anniversary of becoming parents 31 years ago. And I can still, maybe like you can, it is still clear as anything to me, the moment that she was born. It's still in my memory. Even though we were awake all night, there was a rush to that moment. I didn't sleep all day just because the adrenaline was going. But it doesn't take very long for that to wear off, does it? At some point, the reality of being a parent becomes evident. It's the toughest job you're ever going to do. And even though all three of our kids are out on their own pretty much, you never stop being a parent, do you? A few years after Laura was born, Shannon came along, and we still had that same rush the day that she was born. But things get challenging. A few years later, Liz was gone, and I was on my own with the kids, and at some point, I had to go into the bathroom. And I don't know why this stuff happens when you're in the bathroom, but I heard this bang and a cry, and then the first sentence I heard was our oldest saying, "Shannon, don't get blood on the carpet." Following Jesus comes with this initial rush. We call it a mountaintop experience. And whether I'm at camp or on a retreat, whenever we have this situation, we talk to people about coming down from the mountain, because at some point you have to come down from that mountain and live within the reality, within the world of being a Christian. Much of the New Testament in the Bible, it's made up of letters written by a man named Paul, and he writes to individuals and to churches, to certain regions. And one of these letters we heard from this morning, it's written to a group of people living in a region called Galatia, where the church is growing very quickly. But the people share a common dilemma with us today. What do you do when the initial rush of having Jesus Christ take over your life goes away? How do we live as Christians without getting bogged down in the details of being the church? Starting a new series today, one that I've done before just with a different set of questions about for all the days that end in Y. These are why questions. And these are my own why questions. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago I had you submit why questions, and I've got a few of my own, and one of those, this is my own thing, why are some Christians so hard for us to like? Present company accepted. Okay, I know my escape routes from here. Many of us, and I mentioned this in the introduction, many of us can identify with this cartoon. I wouldn't worry about all this yelling and swearing. They'll know we are Christians by our bumper stickers. Brennan Manning wrote something several years ago that became a popular meme on Facebook. He wrote this: "The greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips, walk out the door and deny him by their lifestyle. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. Unfortunately, this is nothing new. This has been a problem since the creation of the church. The early church struggled with this. I'm convinced this is what kept Paul awake at night. But each of us, every single one of us who profess Jesus as Lord, sooner or later we need to wrestle with the question. The question being, am I part of the problem or part of the solution? Am I part of the problem or part of the solution? Let's talk today about the problem, but by the time we leave here, I hope you're committed to being part of the solution. You see, Christian, that word Christian, it's a broad term. One that we find Jesus never used to describe his followers. The word that Jesus used was disciple. But Jesus also issues a warning. Throughout his ministry, he would issue this warning. All four Gospels use the same term. He used the illustration of his disciples being stumbling blocks. And there are several places in the Gospel that point to this. Jesus anointed Peter. Remember this? He anointed Peter and called Peter the rock. You are the rock on which I will build my church. And then we find not too long after this, Peter, armed with this knowledge, steps in and he wants his own way. And here's Jesus' response to Peter. He says, you are a stumbling block to me. If Jesus is going to say this to Peter, of all people, we need to be aware of where Jesus may say this in our own lives. So what's a stumbling block? Here's how Jesus defines a stumbling block. You are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Whereas our mind, the stumbling block is a theme, as I said, all throughout Jesus' ministry. In Matthew 18, he makes this warning, and this isn't the only place he makes this warning. He says, woe to the world because of stumbling blocks. Occasions for stumbling are bound to come. Why? Because we're human, and Jesus knows this. But woe to the one by whom the stumbling block comes. Now, that stumbling block, it doesn't have to be a physical thing. It doesn't need to be a physical block. Oftentimes, a stumbling block is a barrier, an invisible barrier, but it's there nonetheless. It's a barrier to faith. It's a barrier to Jesus. It's a barrier to belief. It's a barrier that humans create. And the message is obvious. Jesus knows this. I can sum it all right here, okay? I'll even wag my finger and say, don't be a stumbling block. That's the message. And let me say this, if I in any way for you have ever been a stumbling block in any way to your faith, I apologize. Please forgive me. Because here's what's clear in the Bible. Jesus was very concerned about his disciples and followers being a barrier. So if stumbling blocks are the problem, how do we find the solution? Well, the solution doesn't lie in some new program or a convenient 4 or 6 week study, because what we find is the solution lies in each one of us. The real tragedy is not always in someone else's definition of what it means to be a Christian. The real tragedy for me is when somebody outside of the faith makes a decision about their relationship with Jesus, about the fate of their soul, based on someone's definition of what it means to be a Christian. We need to take this seriously. Woe to the one by whom the stumbling block comes. You know, I said this earlier, Jesus nor any of the gospel writers used the word Christian to refer to Jesus' followers. The first time we see this word is actually in a cultural context. In Acts 11:26, it says that the disciples were called Christians first in Antioch. And someone who was not, a group of people who were not followers of Jesus came up with this. The word is actually coined, and what it means is little Christ. Think about that. Christians are little Jesuses. That's who we're to reflect. A Christian, by definition, is a follower, while a disciple, by definition, is a learner, a student. And the hard reality is that many people hide behind the word Christianity and shy away from being a disciple. Many people hide behind the word Christian and shy away from being a disciple. There's a quote that I've had on the wall in my office for many years that I love. Here's the quote. It says, "A disciple is being made because we are going to engage in a conversation that will never end." A disciple is being made because we are going to engage in a conversation that will never end. And I like this quote, not because of what it says, but who said it. It wasn't a famous preacher. It was not even a preacher who's not famous. It wasn't a preacher at all. It was a business leader. It was a man by the name of Ken Schmidt. If you're not familiar with him, he was, at the time he said this, he was a corporate strategist for Harley Davidson motorcycles. Yeah, the motorcycle people. And literally he used this concept to turn Harley Davidson around. Before he became involved, Harley Davidson was in a world of hurt. They were close to bankruptcy. They were all set to close their doors, and then they brought Schmidt in, and he literally changed the culture of the business around this concept of, he walked in and he said, we're not going to refer to our customers as customers. We're going to refer to them as disciples, and they're going to sell our motorcycles. And he said about recreating the corporate culture and brand of Harleys. Now, how many motorcycle people do we have in here? Oh, come on, there's more than this. Well, if you don't believe me, if you're weary about this, just drive by a Harley dealership on the weekend, and it's packed. Talk to a Harley rider about their bike, and they're a disciple. They will tell you all about it. They will tell you all they love about it. That's how they sell their bikes, because they're riders. They treat them and they train them as disciples. In the Bible, literally, in a corporate culture, they're bearing fruit. That's what the Bible calls it. We are to bear fruit. Every life bears fruit. And as Jesus says, we need to be careful if we're bearing good fruit or bad fruit. In his Sermon on the Mount, he's wrapping it up, and he said, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. And he says, you will know them by their fruits. And the key here is not to hide behind Christianity, nor shy away from being a disciple. The fruits here are found in what Paul shared this morning, in what Joan read from Galatians 5. It said, focus on these, the fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. If we're going to have a conversation that never ends, and that's really what being a disciple of Jesus is, it's a conversation that will never end. If we're going to have that conversation, here's where it begins. The mission of the church is to do what? Make disciples of Jesus Christ. And the vision is really in practicing and perfecting, producing this fruit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, and anything else is a distraction. Now, what's interesting here is all of these characteristics are attributes of God himself, manifested in Jesus Christ and presented to us as a gift through the Holy Spirit. So that as these gifts grow in us, we become more Christ-like. We become for the world little Christs. And it all begins with this one concept. Honestly, if you spent your days focusing on these, you're not going to have time for anything else. Focus on this every day for the rest of your life. You won't have time for anything else. But it all begins with love. On the last night, at the last meal that Jesus had with his disciples, he gave them what he called a new command: to love one another. He said this, "By this all will know that you are my disciples." You know how this goes. If you do what? If you I know we don't have coffee this morning. By this, all of you will know that you are my disciples if you... There we go. So how will the world know? How will your family know? How will your workplace know? How will our schools know? How will the community know? Peter makes this challenge when he reminds us. I love this line, 1 Peter 2:12. He says, "Live such good lives among the pagans, among the unbelievers, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, though they may disagree with you, though they may disagree with your methods, they may see your good deeds and glorify God." Live in such a way that the unbelievers look into your life, look into the church, look into our lives and say, "Look at that. Look at that. Look at the way they treat one another. Look at the way the men treat the women. Look at the way the women treat the men. Look at the way they teach their children. Look at the way they come together when there's a need and they bring comfort and food to that family who just went through an unspeakable tragedy. Look at that. Look at what they post on Facebook. Look at this. Look at the way they love. Maybe it's time to discover something new. Or maybe it's time to rediscover Jesus. Maybe it's time for others to know us as disciples. Maybe it's time for those outside to know us not by our divisions, not by our failings, not by our clever and sanctimonious bumper stickers or yard signs, but to know us how? I'm not convinced. To know us how? By our love. On the back of your bulletin, if you didn't pick one up, you can pick one up on the way out. This will be on the screen. I've done this before, but quite honestly, I don't know if I've done it here. And so if I have, then we'll do it again, because we need to be reminded. There's an exercise that I love that we shared today from 1 Corinthians 13. You know this is the love chapter. And what happens when we place ourselves in these verses? For you to put your name in those blanks. If we are to exemplify this love, then when it starts, what did I say? It starts with each one of us. And so maybe for the first time, maybe it's time to rediscover yourself in these verses. I invite you to say it with me and put your name there where the blank goes. I invite you to share in this together, that people may know us by our love. Let's read this together. With your name in the blank. And so Kevin is patient. Say it with me. Kevin is kind. Kevin is kind. Kevin does not envy. Kevin does not boast. Kevin is not proud. Kevin does not dishonor others, is not self-seeking, is not easily angered, keeps no records of wrongs. Kevin does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. Kevin always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. This is our prayer, this is our plan as we go out into the world, so that they may know us by our fruit and by our love.